So let's get into what we're talking about tonight. So some atheists are really hopeful that religion is going to die out one day, like completely. Eventually, as people learn more and more about science and the universe, belief in supernatural beings is just going to kind of go away. And so today, I've invited Dr. Justin Barrett, a cognitive scientist of religion, on to explain why he believes that the science points in the opposite direction. If anything, the scientific data confirm that religion is here to stay. If you want to learn more about the intellectual side of Christian belief and you want to just see some intelligent conversations between Christians and non-Christians, and then just learn about philosophy of religion more generally, make sure to subscribe to the channel, turn on the little bell so you don't miss any of our videos. To introduce my guest tonight, Professor Barrett is regarded as one of the founders of the cognitive science of religion field, and he's also been called, quote, one of the world's leading scientists in his area. He explores the question of whether the human mind is predisposed to religious thought, a theme at the center of the cognitive science of religion. Dr. Barrett has authored more than 100 chapters and articles concerning cognitive, developmental, and evolutionary approaches to the study of religion. His interdisciplinary interests are evident in that he uses scholarly journal publications in anthropology, philosophy, religious studies, psychology, and even literary studies in interdisciplinary journals. So if you've been following my channel a while and you see a lot of value in the content that I produce here, please consider supporting me on Patreon. Patrons get early access to videos and blog posts, podcast episodes. They get early access to after shows when we have those. We don't have any tonight. You can also win monthly book giveaways that we have. So if you want to support me and you also want to get cool stuff in return, head over to patreon.com/capturingchristianity. The link to that is also in the description of the video. It's super easy to find. My goal is to be full-time with this ministry by 2020. I think that's completely doable. And with your support, we can make it happen. All right, so let's get into today's interview. Just tell you a little about the structure, and let me actually go ahead and pull up my window here so we can see Dr. Justin Barrett. So here he is. Welcome to the show. What should I call you? Justin, Barrett, Doctor? What should I call you?
Justin's fine, thanks.
Justin, okay. All right. Well, so here's the sort of plan for tonight. So the first half, I have some questions prepared. We'll get through those. The second half we'll devote to you guys, the audience watching. So if you have any questions for Dr. Barrett as we're going on, or for Justin, as we're going through, write them down or think, or just hold them in your mind. Don't actually type them out yet, because we're going to, as we get going, I'm going to ask you exactly, well, I'll let you know when to ask the questions. All right, so let's hop into it. So take about 60 seconds, Justin, and inform our audience who you are, what you do, why you're interested in science and religion and all the good stuff.
Okay, sure. I'm a professor of psychology at Fuller Theological Seminary. That's my current gig. I'm also Fuller's chief program developer for the Office for Science, Theology, and Religion Initiatives. The acronym there is STAR, so I jointly lead the STAR office at Fuller. And most of what occupies my time in terms of my scholarly work is the scientific study of religion. In particular, I try to draw upon what are called the cognitive sciences. So these are sciences that concern how do human minds work, how do they develop, how do we think, how do we form ideas, concepts, and so forth. We apply that scientific area to the study of religious concepts, thought, behavior, and so forth. And mostly I'm looking at, well, why is it that humans, it seems like, throughout the ages and across cultures have found religious concepts really attractive, that we seem to be drawn to them, and they end up forming these systems that we call religions. So that's the kind of work I do, and it ends up taking me to doing cross-cultural work, experimental work, work with children, developmental work, and lots of stuff. Really feeds my intellectual ADD nicely.
Yeah, so tell me about the work with children. What does that look like? I mean, because children, I have two. I have a 2-year-old and I have a 4-year-old. And I know that some of your work is centered around these very young children, like 3 years old and up. So what is that like difficult to perform these experiments with these really young kids? How does that actually work?
Yeah, it is difficult. What we have to do is come up with experimental tasks that especially for kids of that age that rely very little on their verbal responses, really simple verbal responses, yes, no's, other kinds of very clear, succinct types of things, mostly behavioral kinds of tasks that help us sort of cumulatively figure out, well, what's going on in their little heads. Um, and I kind of got into that approach accidentally. When I started my doctoral study at Cornell, I wanted to study religious concepts, religious cognition, we'd say. And basically, no one was doing it from a cognitive psychology perspective. And my would-be advisor there made a deal with me. He said, all right, I'll supervise this dissertation, but you need to do at least some developmental work. And that was
Hmm.
actually great advice because his insight was he would often say, we get insights into the mature form of human minds by studying development that we could never get by studying the mature form in and of itself. And it turns out he's right about that because one of the nice things about looking at development is we can see how different ideas roll in, how they build upon each other in a way that you just can't with adult minds. But you didn't ask that. You asked, how do you do it with kids? And basically, we set up these little experiments, demonstrations, and we ask kids judgments about these little tasks. And based on those judgments, we can make inferences about what's going on in their heads. If you want an example, I can explain one, but I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole if you don't want me to go there.
Yeah, let's hold off on that for a second because we are going to get into the evidence, and maybe one of these experiments you've done is going to pop up in your mind to tell us. But let me just back up a second. So today we're talking about, again, will religion die? And so I've invited a guy named Dr. Justin Barrett. He's an eminent scientist of religion, and what he argues is that science basically shows that religion is here to stay for various reasons, for various scientific reasons. And so let's get clear, first of all, why this topic is important. I actually posted a poll earlier today on Twitter. Let me actually refresh this. And I should have been more prepared and so I could show you guys what this looks like. But you can just rely on my testimony for now. So 653 votes. The question I asked was, as scientific knowledge progresses, religion will eventually die out, true or false? 35% said true, 65% said false. Now, some of the skeptics, some of the atheists that responded to this did say that they don't think it's going to happen. They wish it would happen, but they don't think it's going to happen. But it does look like, it's not a huge sample, but of the people that voted, there's a good percentage that think that if eventually religion is going to die out as scientific knowledge increases. And so let me just ask you, Justin, why do you think that this question is important to respond to in the first place?
Well, I think it's important to respond to because it says something about what we are as humans. What's our nature like? How do we anchor that nature socially? How do we scaffold our values and so forth? And the idea that religious thought is this sort of special protected kind of thought is a very common idea of democracies around the world too. And if it goes away, then there's this sort of gap, this lacuna that we need to figure out, well, what's going to be taking that place? So even if one is optimistic about religion, whatever that is going to go away, then that seems to suggest somebody has something in mind about, well, and I hope that these kinds of things will fill that space. And I mean, that's just a broadly human question because it may require citizenry from lots of nations around the world to sort of jointly decide, well, what is that thing that's going to fill that gap and will it do the job? So I think those are some of the issues in this space. And I mean, for the nerd in me, it's just a fun question too, because whenever you have one of these that has kind of historical sort of evidence in the background, and then it's got this contemporary science stuff, but yet we have to speculate about the future. Come on, this is great talk. This is good. So, let's have at it.
Yeah, we love to speculate about the future. That's sort of, I guess, human nature. All right. So in your book, Born Believers, which is an amazing book, by the way, you guys should pick it up. I have it linked in the description of the video.
Well, thanks.
So you say the following. I actually have a quote here. So quote, scientific research on children's developing minds and supernatural beliefs suggests that children normally and rapidly acquire minds that facilitate belief in supernatural agents. And so my question is basically, what's the scientific basis for this claim?
Yeah, good question. And that's what the book is about. But it's also about 7 years old now. So more and more evidence keeps coming in, and I'd probably say things a little differently now than what I did then. Um, Let me give you a metaphor that I've become fond of recently,
Okay.
and we'll compare religion or religions or religious thought, whatever, or to dance. Um, why dance? Dance too is a cultural form, like religions are a cultural form. Um, Dance is something that we've seen around the world across cultures and as far back in history as we can find. And yet, not everyone would claim that they're a dancer. That's what's kind of interesting about it, is with very few exceptions, every culture has dance and it has dances. Just like pretty much around the world, every culture has things that look like religions, but not everybody necessarily identifies with it. But it's one of those perfect little examples of a form of cultural expression that sure looks like it's suspiciously recurrent. So there must be something behind it. And then if we start looking at how it develops in childhood and so forth in dance, in the case of dance, for instance, we see little precursors, like kids readily imitate the actions of adults around them. They start moving rhythmically very easily. And in fact, this kind of rhythmic movement is something that we see almost exclusively in humans, among at least mammals. We see it in some birds, interestingly, who will do some rhythmic moving. But humans are just we're really big into rhythm, and we're really big into imitating behaviors and sort of doing group behaviors and all of these things that you can see where you put them together the right way and you get something that looks like dance. Likewise, religious thought, if we want to be more specific, thought about supernatural agents is a little bit like that. It's not that there's one thing, like a God spot in the brain or a gene mutation, that makes you religious or not. Rather, there seem to be lots of these little cognitive mechanisms, thought patterns, little subroutines of how our mind works that incline us towards certain beliefs that are easily joined up around an idea about one or more gods. And those include things like, we seem to, research by Deborah Kellerman especially, and her collaborators at Boston University have shown that from early childhood, we've got this strong tendency to see design and purpose in the natural world. From childhood, if somebody looks at the long neck of a giraffe, for instance, or the pointiness of a rock, or whatever it is, we immediately start wondering, what's it for? Why is it that way? What's its function? What's its purpose? She calls this teleological reasoning or teleofunctional reasoning. And it seems to be a natural way that we sort of try to make sense of the world around us. And in fact, her studies, even with adults, are starting to show it doesn't look like we outgrow that. So when we see natural kinds of things, we wonder, well, why is it that way? What is its function? What's its purpose?
And this applies across culture, right? It's not just like in America.
That's right. This applies across cultures. Different cultural conditions will sort of tamp it down, but it's there in the background. And in fact, she's done some really clever recent experiments with adults giving cognitive load, it's called, where you have to answer really quickly, for instance, and shows that we've got this, our attraction to these teleofunctional explanations for the natural kinds, things going on in the natural world, goes up when we have to answer quickly. And in fact, there's a hint that even in very secular societies, she looked at Finland, for instance, in one of her recent studies with Elisa Jarnefeld, that there's a tendency to see not just design and purpose behind the natural world, but that someone intended it, that it's there for the intentions of someone. Even in highly secular kind of atheists, even in atheist populations, there's a tendency to kind of go there when unguarded. So these seem to be natural intuitions we have just for making sense of the world, and they incline us toward thinking, oh, well, there's design, I see purpose. I wonder who did it. Because from infancy, kids know if something's got a reason, it's got a purpose. Someone purposed it. There's someone behind it.
Hmm.
That connection is really easy to make because it's pretty unusual in our world to find things that look meaningful, purposeful, and it was just sort of dumb luck. You might think, well, but there are mechanistic reasons for why stalactites look the way they do and they have this sort of pointy shape. Well, sure there are, but that's not where our minds naturally go. It's the, yeah, why? What's the function of it? What's the purpose of it? So that's one little piece.
Yeah, and so would you say, like going to the whole topic here, is religion eventually going to die? Would you say this is one piece of evidence that suggests the opposite?
What I'd say is, so this is one of those little cognitive mechanisms that religious belief systems are built on that we've got no reason to think it's going away, right? So if you think that all of the little foundational anchor points, that's one, there are others, but there's one. So if you imagine all of these little anchor points that we build these cultural systems on, these belief systems on, and if those don't go away, they're always going to be there in the background looking for something to attach to them.
Mm.
I sometimes compare it to those, preschool shape sorters, where you've got the maybe your
You
kids
worked with kids too much.
Well, yeah, but you've got kids, right? You've got one of those
Yeah.
shape sorters yet? I mean, so they can go, okay, here's
Yeah, we do. We do. We
the
probably have five
triangle
different
goes in
kinds.
this one, and the round one goes in that one. That thing.
Yep.
The way our minds naturally develop, it sure looks like we've got these. You might think of it as conceptual spaces that are just looking for a cultural input to fit in that space. Well, you can change the cultural surroundings, including via science. Okay,
Hmm.
science is a cultural construct around there, but that doesn't change that conceptual space that's sort of looking for something to go into it. So I'd say the conceptual readiness or receptivity to belief in supernatural agents, the idea that there's something about ourselves that's separate, that can be separated from our bodies potentially, and in various traditions that's spirit or soul or whatever it is, that there's something that's me that isn't just my body, that idea, the idea of out there maybe being an afterlife, all of those are so strongly natural that they're going to be kind of lurking in the background. They're just waiting for the right kind of cultural form to get there. And I can't see that science, at least in any near period of time, is gonna touch those intuitions. And we've got plenty of interesting data starting to come out in the study of atheists that I think corroborates that intuition that I have.
Well, go ahead, and I was going to ask you to sort of give another one of those pillars, but
Okay.
I'm kind of interested now to talk about the studies into atheists, because I know that that's actually something that has sort of been neglected over the years, is studying sort of the cognitive, the scientific reasons behind why atheists are atheists. But anyway, so where do you want to go? Do you want to give another pillar, or do you want to talk about atheists?
Well, why don't I give you another pillar or two, and then that'll help fill out the story about why then we seem to see what we're seeing with atheists. So we've got this teleofunctional reasoning about the natural world that seems to be there. Um, Jesse Bering, who has worked in this area, has also suggested that we've got this sort of natural tendency to find meaning in events. He sometimes calls this an existential theory of mind, um, which is a big fancy term, but really that we've got this natural tendency that when stuff happens, and he's not alone in this,
It happens
uh,
for a reason.
it happens for a reason, at least when it is especially sort of positive or negative, right? It's great misfortune or fortune. Lots of psychologists, again, starting with developmental psychology, but also cross-culturally looking at adults, we see evidence that if something bad happens to somebody, people's intuition is they probably did something morally wrong, or at least they're more likely to have recently done something morally wrong. It's in the textbooks called
Kind of
just
like
world
karma.
thinking. It is, and it maps onto karma really nicely. In fact, I think it's part of the psychological structure for karma.
Huh.
Any of these really successful kinds of cultural mechanisms probably have some kind of psychological core that's pretty natural. Otherwise, they wouldn't succeed. They wouldn't take off most of the time. So yeah, so we seem to have this kind of you might think an intuitive, existential or meaning-making sense. Then there's this sort of general tendency to really make sense of meaning and purpose in the natural world, or the meaning of events, in terms of persons. We are immensely social animals. So much of what makes us the special kind of animal we are is that we are constantly trying to figure out what the thoughts are of intentional beings, right? Each other human beings.
Yeah.
But it's such a strong tendency to in us that a lot of folks working in the cognitive science of religion have said it. And yeah, and the boundaries don't just stop with humans. I mean, look at the way we treat our cars or our computers. We yell at them. we get mad at them when they don't work properly. We talk to them as if they're human beings. You can get that sort of theory of mind, it's called. It's a theory of, it's how we understand other minds, going really easily. And we can do it with natural events too, with the structure of animals or rivers or mountains. And we see design and purpose. We see events as meaningful, and our easiest way to make sense of those is in terms of, well, who did it, and why did they do it? What were their motives? What were their thoughts, their beliefs, their desires? If those are the sort of natural ways we think, it's really easy to see how joined up those can support what we normally think of as religious cognition, right? Okay.
Yeah. So I'm thinking about Toy Story right now, and
Okay.
I'm thinking about that in particular because I'm thinking about kids and how they apply theory to mind to stuff, and so maybe intuitively, like the Toy Story creators were thinking, well, let's give these toys minds because kids probably already give them minds. I don't know.
That's a really easy step. I mean, if you've got a toy that's got a face on it, from infancy, from birth, kids are selectively attending to faces in their environment. I mean, like within 24 hours of birth, they're already selectively attending to faces because faces are so important.
Wow.
And then they're trying to imitate those facial expressions right away, and especially around the eyes. And this is not a trivial kind of thing. A lot of animals don't do this. In fact, you look around, especially predatory animals living in groups that have hierarchical structures, they generally won't look each other in the eyes. Humans do. Some people are already thinking, my dog does, yes. And we've selectively bred them to be like us. We like that in them. But that's not normally what your wolf pack will do. They're not going to stare each other in the eye because that's a threat. That's a confrontation. But we're constantly reading each other's eyes because they're so rich in information about what's going on inside the heads. And we see that from the word go in babies. So in Toy Story, toys that have faces instantly are triggering, oh, it's an agent. I can play along with this so easily. But it turns out you don't even need faces. All you need is contingent kind of movement. And really clever little studies with experiments have shown, clever experiments with infants have shown that you can just have an object that flashes at the right time or moves itself, kind of in a remote control fashion. Or
that looks like it has an intelligence behind it, maybe?
Yeah, and suddenly it's being treated in a completely different way. Babies will start vocalizing at it instead of just pushing it around, and they treat it like a minded being.
Wow.
So this system seems to be just ready to go, and it can get triggered in lots of different settings. Which has led me at times to refer to it as sort of a hypersensitive agency detection device that we see from very early infancy. And that's, again, one of these little cognitive systems that contributes to the easy detection of, oh, there are agents around doing stuff. Even if I don't see a physical body of the normal sense, that's okay. I don't need one.
So take us back to the atheist side of things, because you gave a bunch of pillars so far,
Yep.
And this was supposed to shed light on like what we've kind of learned about atheism so far.
Okay, so then, because these seem to be part of our natural human equipment, deciding to be an atheist doesn't make them go away, right? Or being raised in an atheist culture doesn't make them go away. They're still there. Okay, so you're still going to have intuitions. Even as a committed atheist living in a place like, Iceland is one of the top 10 most atheist countries on earth, you're still going to have the same kind of intuitions that the things in the natural world look the way they do for a reason or a purpose, you're still going to attach meaning to storms or winning the lottery or whatever it is. You're still going to find yourself drawn to think in terms of who did it. You're going to still feel that pull, even if you're getting taught and enculturated with the idea of, yeah, but not God, not a capital G God. No, 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 not that. That's not the answer. That's not the thing to put in that conceptual gap. So we see in a place like Iceland, for instance, that a majority of Icelanders actually believe in elves. It's like 52%.
Wow. What kind of elves are we talking about here? Like,
Well, there's sometimes elves is, I mean, it doesn't translate in English real well. It's sometimes called the hidden people. Elves, fairies, they're somewhere in between that. They're kind of nature spirits in a way.
mm,
And in fact, there are laws on the books that prevent you from, just building a road through an area where the hidden people are known to live without first, getting permission from them and all kinds of stuff that, we might think outside of that context is kind of strange. And you might find especially surprising from a country that is well known for being so atheistic.
well, and so your point is that this just shows that this is so natural, like even in an atheistic culture, it's still going to pop up in different ways.
It's
I
going to
guess.
pop up in different ways. And so we've been seeing, for instance, that as church attendance and people identifying as Christian in, say, the United Kingdom has been going down, 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 down over the last 30 years, belief in astrology and occult and other kinds of, and ghosts has been going up proportionately.
Wow.
We see in, China, we know, okay, the most atheistic country on earth. Yes, and everyone pretty much engages in certain rituals to propitiate the ancestors, to honor their ancestors, but not just because it's a good thing to honor your ancestors, but because you'll get something out of it. The ancestors will actually do stuff for you if you do these things. Okay? So the ancestors are superhuman agents at that point. That's very, very common in China, an allegedly atheistic country. And it is atheistic in the sense, if you mean atheist, means they reject capital G God. That
Right. Yeah. Yeah, they do.
So there's a big research project ongoing that's based in the UK called the Understanding Unbelief Project. Just this summer, they had their sort of 2/3 of the way through a conference in Rome. Their sort of check-in, and they've done this really cool kind of mix of psychological, sociological, and anthropological work in 6 countries: the United Kingdom, United States, China, Japan, Denmark, and Brazil. And they've been just focusing on people who would say, I don't believe that there is a God, and so atheists, and people who'd say, I don't know if there's a God or not, and I'm pretty sure there, and I don't think there's any way to ever find out. So what we would normally call agnostic folks. And one of the interesting things that they have found, at least in their preliminary findings, is the overwhelming majority of those folks who are either atheist or agnostic by the way we would normally talk about them in the United States, they're not naturalists. They don't reject all supernatural stuff. They're just not so sure about this capital G God person. And in fact, even in the United States, it's a minority who are thoroughgoing, what we'd call naturalists, who don't think there's anything supernatural.
Mm-hmm.
It's a minority. In China, basically, I believe the number is somewhere upwards of 90% of people who you would identify as an atheist or agnostic actually believe in supernatural stuff. So all of this to say that this sort of clean break, that if you somehow are an atheist, then you don't have any of those kinds of intuitions that are driving what we would normally think of as a religious or supernatural thought. Well, it's just not true.
It just shows up in different ways.
It shows up in different ways. Some people, yeah, they work hard, and or maybe there's something about them and their personality and their upbringing, whatever it is, and they're pretty strongly committed naturalists. But that's a pretty small slice of humanity, it turns out.
This is actually really revealing because at my previous job that I was at very recently, I had a coworker who was in one conversation with her. I realized or came to understand that she was a sort of agnostic, maybe even an atheist, but she was a big like believer in astrology.
Yeah,
And I was like
that's
challenging
common.
her. Yeah, I was like challenging her one day on it. I was like, well, yeah, I mean, I don't believe in astrology because I don't think there's any good evidence or reason to think that it's true or whatever. And she was like, kind of defending it. And so it was interesting that
Did she
tying back
point out
in
that it's in the Bible?
what astrology's in the Bible.
Yeah.
Oh no, 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 no,
You don't want to go there, huh? Never mind. Sorry. Go ahead.
no, it's all good. Well, just to remind everyone what we're doing right now, we're talking about the scientific evidence that shows that religion is not going anywhere. We talked about some of the pillars, the sort of cognitive. What was
Foundation.
the term that you used? Foundations, but you also used the term like the little analogy of the peg hole. That
Yeah,
there's
yeah.
these.
Conceptual
There's
spaces. Yeah.
Yeah, our cognitive makeup is such that we're going to believe in something. If it's not capital G God, then most likely we're going to end up believing in something else like elves or fairies or something supernatural, right? Something supernatural is going to happen. That's what we're talking about tonight. And so I have back to your book, I have another quote from you here. And you make a distinction that I think is really helpful. You say, the evidence to date supports only the naturalness of belief in a mighty creator God, not that children are born to believe in Orthodox Muslim, Jewish, or Christian theology, or any other for that matter. And so why do you think this distinction is important?
Yeah. What I don't want to give the impression of is that I'm claiming that children are born with, or they will naturally develop with some kind of a Christian or Muslim or whatever God concept, and that if not for parents coming in and messing it up, that's what they would develop into. And I think it's important to say that because actually, as I've started doing work in this area, I've had folks write to me and say, "Hey, what you're saying about the naturalness of religious belief, especially from early childhood, fits with what we teach in Islam, for instance." Um, so there is a strain of Islamic thought that says children naturally are believers in Allah, and it's their parents or society that messes them up. And I had a Hindu once when I was doing some traveling in India for some research purposes say something very similar. Oh yeah, children know the divine really well because they've been with the divine more recently and they haven't forgotten. Well, I don't know about that. Okay, that's not where the evidence is pointing at this point. I don't have any reason to think. I have no scientific evidence to point to kids having these well-developed, clear concepts of God that then they somehow lose. That's not quite it. What it looks like is children have natural propensities, natural receptivities to ideas like there are agents around that don't have bodies that may account for why there is design and purpose in the natural world. They may account for the origins of the natural world, why certain bad and good things happen. It's easy for kids to believe those types of things. It's easy for them to think of the idea of an afterlife and things like that. All of those are really easy for kids. And what needs to be filled in is the particulars, the details. Those seem to be where cultural input really is critical, to either fill out the picture or in some cases to sort of push it aside and say, no, yeah, you have those intuitions, but here's why they don't count. So am
Yeah,
I
yeah, yeah.
making that clear enough?
I think so. There was another quote, and I don't have it pulled up, but as I was reading through it, I remember reading something along the lines of like these. I guess our brains just sort of automatically produce these types of religious beliefs, and then culture is what sort of fine tunes them into the various doctrines that you see in specific religious beliefs.
Yeah, that's not so bad. I I would I guess I would think that the beliefs that we as individuals generate probably are pretty skeletal. Once we start interacting with each other, they become a little fleshier. And then once they're put within a cultural context, they become sort of full-bodied. Um, and I think in some of my writing, I have compared this to at least some views of what is sometimes called the sensus divinitatis in Christian theology, especially Reformed theology, that this idea that we've got a sense of the divine that's kind of there baked into us. The inspiration for that theological concept often comes from Romans, the first chapter of Romans.
Well, I like your analogy of the skeleton, because that makes it kind of seem like bare bones. You have this bare bones idea of God, and then you can build on top of it.
Yeah, and look, I mean, from just the scientific evidence, I've also tried to make clear the claim is also not that these natural sort of cognitive foundations or engines that sort of drive belief point to a monotheistic kind of God, that kind of a world. They support a creator kind of God. But note that strict monotheism, that there's one and only one God, might not be all that natural. And in fact, if we look at even, I come from a Christian tradition, but you can sort of tell by reading the Christian scriptures, we don't think that there's just one supernatural being. That's not Christian orthodoxy. And there are many supernatural beings that are talked about, at least traditionally within Christianity.
Yeah,
there's only
angels
one
and
creator
demons
God. Angels, demons, even, ghosts make weird appearances here and there. At the Witch of Endor, we've got Halloween coming up. Let's all go back to our favorite Christian sort of ghost stories. And that idea that there are lots of different little lesser gods seems to be a pretty natural kind of thing, or that there are ghosts, gods, little g gods. So I also don't want to give the impression that I'm just saying, oh,
all the evidence supports monotheism.
Yeah,
or belief in monotheism.
Yeah, that's just not where the science is right now.
So is your view on this, that religion is here to stay? Is this something you see that is controversial in the field and with your colleagues, especially atheist colleagues, or is this more of like a sort of thing that almost everybody holds?
A lot of it depends on what we mean by religion, right? Because it's a slippery word. But no, most of my colleagues, at least in cognitive science or religion, would, whether they're atheists or religious in one way or the other, are pretty comfortable with the idea of, no, this is pretty stable stuff. You'd have to work really hard to get rid of any and all kinds of religious cultural expression. I mentioned Jesse Bering earlier. In some ways, he's been one of the most outspoken advocates of the view that religion isn't going away. And he is an atheist. He hasn't been shy about that. He says, look, I'm an atheist. I've studied atheists. We've got these intuitions. We often find ourselves going, what am I thinking? That's just nonsense. Push it away. And, I know that sort of flies in the face of this sort of common discourse these days where people are saying, well, but look, the rise of nuns and NONES and the rise of people claiming to be atheists or agnostic. Like, yeah, but look more closely at those data, and what we see is it's a rise of people who are rejecting a particular kind of religious expression, a particular or various particular kinds of religious expression. But most of them, they're still supernaturalists in one way.
In some other way, yeah, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so we're about to move to question and answer for the audience. So if you have a question for Dr. Barrett or Justin, then just drop it in the live chat. Make sure to tag at Capturing Christianity so that I can see it. I'm going to pop over and start viewing the live chat when I ask my last question to Justin. But that's what we're about to do. So if you have a question, write it down now, and I'll try to ask as many as we can. We have about 15, 20 minutes to go. So here's my last question. In many developed countries, like in the UK and Sweden, and you also mentioned Iceland, so we've seen a rapid decline in religious affiliation in the past 100 years. So what do you credit that to? And then does it conflict with any of your work?
Yeah, I think that we're seeing a number of drivers for that disaffiliation. One of the biggest drop-offs we've seen, honestly, has to do with the Catholic priest scandal. I think people
Hmm.
underestimate just what a huge force that has been in turning people away. It's disappointment with the structures and institutions. Um, and I think that one, I don't want to pick on that one too much, but in bigger and smaller ways, we see that in other countries, even if they weren't predominantly Catholic countries. I bring that one up because the change in Irish, for instance, in the Republic of Ireland, the disaffiliation has been so precipitous, and it's almost completely driven by those issues. But we see in other countries, like you mentioned, Sweden, where the state has stepped in and started playing the same roles that traditionally the church did. And so what you're seeing more is a disaffiliation with a particular political or power structure that used to be the church. I think part of that is that churches have stopped playing the role. This is another way of saying it. Stopped playing the ritual role, the social fabric role that they used to play. We've offloaded a lot of that to the state. So I think that's a factor. There's no doubt that a certain form of scientific triumphalism has played a role. Again, back to that understanding unbelief project, one of the interesting things that they have found so far is it looks like people who are atheists or agnostics in their respective countries are, with one exception, are are more likely, this is the case in Denmark, UK, US, and Brazil, are more likely to say that the only way we can know things is through science. The only way we can reliably know things. Um, that's got to be playing some kind of a role. That it's an epistemology of what science can and can't do, and I call it a triumphalism because it doesn't take much to pause and realize, okay, no intelligent person really believes that claim, because what would follow from it. In fact, I think it was worded as the scientific method is the only way we can get reliable knowledge. Well, if that's true, then before the scientific method, sometime in the 16th century, nobody knew anything, at least not reliably. And in fact, you don't know what you had for breakfast because you can't figure that out through the scientific method. That's just crazy talk. Nobody who even reflects briefly on that is it really will go down that path. And I don't think these atheists and agnostics from these countries are dumb. So I don't think they really mean it. I think they're signaling some kind of an allegiance to science is the best way forward to solve our intellectual problems, to develop technologies to solve problems in the world. I think that's what's being signaled there. Um, and so surely that has played some kind of a role. But those are some of my speculations, informed or uninformed as they may be.
All right. So I've got one question here from a good friend of mine. His name is Ale. He says, "Is Justin familiar with the meta study that religious belief is positively associated with moral concern?" And let me pull up the link he's put here. Are you familiar with any of that
With
off
the
the top?
study, your audio cut out actually just as you were saying what the name of the study was.
Okay, so the study is the name of it. Why do you believe in God? Relationships between religious belief, analytic thinking, mentalizing, and moral concern. Anthony Ian Jack, Jared Parker Friedman, Richard Boyetzes, Scott Taylor.
I know some of those guys. Um,
I'm not sure. Yeah, so Ale, if you have like a follow up with him, if you wanted to ask him a very specific question about what he was, what his thoughts were on that specific study, then let me know.
this
Unless you
sounds
had
like
something to
it's
say.
part of a number of studies that have been done in the last 10 years, showing that some of them showing that if you are higher by some measures of analytic thinking, you are less likely to be religious. You are more likely to be an atheist if you score high on certain kinds of analytic thinking tasks. And in some of these experiments, they've even done little manipulations where uh, different kinds of tasks have been done to try to get people to be more analytic in their thinking, and then measured people's degree of theistic commitment, for instance, and they see a slight dip, at least temporarily, in people's confidence in their belief in God after they've done an analytic kind of task. It seems like, based on that title and some of the names affiliated with it, that it's probably in that line of studies. Is that right?
I'm not sure because I haven't read it, but we'll see if Ale has a follow up.
See if that's right. I mean, one of the things to note there is that those studies have actually shown some pretty strong. They've been very mixed. One of the primary authors of one of the early studies has actually recanted his earlier study because
Mm.
it's failed to replicate very reliably. And I've been part of a team where we tried to replicate it, and what we found is that it seems to depend entirely on what population you're dealing with. So for some people, sure, if they think long and hard, it erodes their confidence in their belief in God. Other people, it actually increases their confidence, it looks like. So it really depends.
Yeah,
It's
so he says they correlated belief in God with moral concern very specifically, and then correlated those with neural networks activation.
with moral concerns. There is a line of relatively new research that's coming out that suggests that one of the, I talked about kind of these conceptual gaps, but that there's kind of a moral gap too, that when that we really want to find sort of a moral reason for why bad and good things happen. Um, if something, who are we going to blame and who are we praise when something bad and good happens? Well, in our normal interactions with each other as human beings, we can blame a human. But if it's a natural kind of event or something that looks like it's outside of the power of individual humans, then it may send us on a search. It goes the hypothesis for someone else,
Hmm.
to account for why did something good or bad happen. And if that's right, then it would follow that people who are especially sensitive to the sort of moral thinking would be more inclined to make those kinds of attributions. But I'm kind of making things up because I don't know that particular paper.
All right, well, let's move on to another question from Nelson. He says, Dr. Justin, does the idea of fair or equality, which very young children seem to understand easily, point to something supernatural, as in things ought to be?
Um,
I guess he's asking about morality.
yeah,
Is
yeah,
morality something and does that point to like a supernatural foundation?
yeah, good. It takes a few steps to get there, but I think it does. Um, So it does look like there are these early developing, fairly reliable cross-cultural tendencies to think in terms of certain things being right and wrong. Um, in fact, just having sort of the gut intuition that things are right
Mm-hmm.
and wrong. One of those has to do with fairness, for sure. That looks like an early developing, sometimes called a moral foundation, from Moral Foundations theory of Jonathan Haidt. He says there are five of these foundations, or sometimes he says six. I think the evidence is stronger for five. One of those is um, the fairness one. Another is harm and care, that you should take care of people and not harm them and so forth. Respect of authority is another. I'll bet that one's, well, there's evidence that that one is operational in early childhood. Kids give automatic deference to adults. In fact, they have to. If they're going to learn anything and survive in this world, they better. So that one's sort of baked in. In-group loyalty, and the last one is sort of sanctity, purity. And again, we see that one operational in pretty young kids. Cameron, you've probably seen this in your kids. They can get disgusted by things that you think that doesn't make sense. And 2 years ago, you were disgusted by nothing and were sticking it in your mouth. What's going on? And now the peas and the potatoes can't touch. Have you lost your mind? What is with it? But what's going on is their disgust mechanism is tuning up, and that one seems to get carried into thinking about purity and sanctity and all kinds of what's sacred, even
Hmm.
in some cases. So there seem to be these little moral foundations that generate moral intuitions, with some cross-cultural regularity, which is kind of fun, but different cultures sort of elaborate upon them. But in that background, then, some things just do seem right and wrong. And we do seem to need to justify those. And we do seem to want to think that there's at least some kind of justness in the world. It's called just world theory. And I do think that then it's plausible to think that leads us to thinking about, well, who's behind it? Who's backing it up? Why did that? Okay, if that person got punished because they did something bad or they were unfair, and it wasn't a human who punished them, well, then who did? So our very active sort of theory of mind system loves to run down those pathways with the moral thinking. So I think you're onto something there.
So Iron Charioteer asks, Islam is a fairly young religion. Do you think that as it matures, it will come into more conflict with Christianity? I'm not sure if that's exactly on topic, but do you have any thoughts?
Oh, um, I do. I don't know if they're really well-educated thoughts. I actually think that the pattern historically, my impression is that it goes the other way around, that as religions get older, they tend to play nicer with each other, not less nice with each other. That seems to be the way that it goes. Some folks have said they get more domesticated. The rough edges get filed off. Now, Christianity and Islam are interesting in that they are religions that do very similar kind of social and intellectual work. So they either can be really good collaborators on certain kinds of activities, or they're going to bump into each other in a way that maybe, say, traditional indigenous religions and Roman Catholicism have typically just sort of, Catholicism just absorbs the other and just lets it sort of keep going in the background because they're not competing for the same social or intellectual space. But that would probably take us far afield if I tried to unpack all that.
Yeah. Well, here's another question from Matthew. We have about 3 more questions, and then we'll close it out for tonight. Matthew asks, is it natural to connect guilt with God or gods? The Greeks in the Iliad made sacrifices to the gods to expiate their guilt. Of course, the ancient Hebrews did too.
And of course, Christians today keep doing their own. Yeah, I think there is something really natural there. You might think of this as one of those things where our ordinary natural psychology actually gets in the way of being theologically correct. It's sometimes called theological incorrectness. So we seem to, as social animals, know that when we're in a cooperative engagement with one or a group of people, we owe certain things, we give, we get, and there need to be certain kinds of equivalences there. And if I mess that up in some way, then I have to make it right. I have to pay my dues. And so if you're in a theological system that says you've done something wrong in the eyes of the God, you got to fix it in some way. And I think this is one of the reasons why the doctrine of grace in Christianity is really hard, and why it is that pastors feel like they have to preach on it, every other Sunday. If it were easy, they'd be able to do it once and then we'd all get it. But it isn't easy, because it seems to run up against that idea that, no, I do need to do something. No, let me do something to make things right with God. I need to pay a certain price to, be okay. Some of us feel that way. And the others of us are mostly concerned with, wait a minute, he didn't pay the price. What's wrong with him? He needs to pay something to get right with God. Because, what's with that guy? Yes. Guilt's God's. Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
So here's another question from Crazy Jesse. He says, how does Dr. Barrett jump from the mistaken connection or meaning and patterns in random information to this information supporting theism?
Okay, how do I jump to, say it again?
How does Dr. Barrett jump from the mistaken connection or meaning and patterns in random information to this information, quote unquote, supporting theism?
Okay, so to be really clear, what I've been talking about is not supporting theism as in you ought to believe this. What I've been talking about is how is it that our minds find support for theism? That is, belief in some kind of a God, or maybe many gods, could be polytheism. How does it sort of find home in the way that our minds work? So let's be clear on that. I didn't say anything about, and you should, because of how the mind works, believe these things. That's another discussion, and an interesting one.
It's a separate question of like whether or not this data that you've been presenting supports theism or whether it supports atheism. That's a separate question.
That's right. That's right. In fact, about 2/3 of the people, I think, roughly, if I were counting noses in my area, cognitive science of religion, about 2/3 are probably atheists or agnostic, and about 1/3 are probably some version of a religious person. And probably 3/4 of the time, we agree on the science. And then we might disagree on what the implications are for whether you ought to believe or not. Those are separate issues. So if we can get that part clear, I wasn't saying that because minds find patterns in things, therefore you ought to believe that there's a God. I didn't say that. Second, though, is more on are there random patterns that we are finding order in? Well, maybe, but we haven't demonstrated that those are random patterns, have we? That's what philosophers call question begging. That is, my agency detection mechanism, that is seeing agents doing things in the world around me, may be accurate. I don't know that it's responding to random data or it's giving me false information. I don't know that unless I've already made a decision that there isn't a God out there. So we can't assume that there is no God and then say, well, clearly the system is responding to random patterns. It's not clear that it's responding to random patterns unless we've got another mechanism for making sure that my agency detection device is off kilter. And as far as I can tell, we don't have such a thing. Let me bring it back down to earth a little bit. It's a lot like right now, I think that I am talking to a bunch of minded people. Particularly Cameron, I can see his face, his expressions. He seems to be moving and blinking, turning his head, looking disgusted in relation to things that I'm saying. I attribute to him a mind. I don't know if that's accurate. Yes, I just said that maybe he doesn't have a mind. I mean, I don't have any scientific evidence that he has a mind of that sort. I have the strong impression that he has a mind because of the way my mind works. My agency detection system says he's an agent, and my theory of mind system has just attributed beliefs, desires, and so forth, the kinds of things we would usually call a mind, to him, consciousness. Maybe that's right. Maybe that's wrong. I'm telling you how the science works, not necessarily what is the case in his head. It seems to me I'm on pretty safe ground, though, in thinking that he's got a mind until I get evidence to the contrary. And it seems to me that at least with some of our religious intuitions, we may be on similar ground, but that is a much longer conversation.
A much more interesting conversation, in my opinion. I'm just kidding. No, that reminds me of Alvin Planning's book. What is it? I can't. It's one of his not I want to say original, but it's one of his first books on the subject of Reformed epistemology.
God
and Other Minds. Yep, there you go. Yeah, it reminds me of that book. Well, anyways, so this is going to be it for tonight. We've had a really great time. This has actually been extremely informative. So I hope you guys enjoyed it
too, folks. Really nice questions.
And is there anything that you'd like to leave the audience with? Maybe some books that they can go check out that you've written, or
I've
already mentioned Born Believers, which is in the description of the video.
Yeah, and that one is a nice, accessible intro to, I hope, to the developmental work. If you're interested in what is this cognitive science stuff that he mentions, and if you want a sort of an easy introduction to what cognitive science is, and then how it might apply to the study of religion and implications for theology, then I've got a book called Cognitive Science, Religion, and Theology, and that's by the Templeton. It's been put out by the Templeton Press. It's pretty short, and I'm told that it's not too hard to read either. So pretty accessible, but I think reasonably authoritative. It's starting to get a little bit older, but those are two that I've done. For people who want something really fun by somebody else who is not a theist, but I think has written a brilliant book in this area, I recommend Robert Macaulay's Why Religion is Natural and Science is Not. He is a philosopher of science, and he is also one of the old guard in the cognitive science of religion. Brilliant guy. It's just a lovely book by Oxford University Press. So those are some I recommend.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate you coming on tonight. And for those of you that want more Capturing Christianity, just look in the description of the video. There's tons of links there. You can just search our old videos, do whatever you want to do. But until next time, we'll see you guys later. So have a good night.